So I'm wondering if you could tell our audience kind of how you got started in working with manatees and what sort of things you've done related to manatees over the years.
Okay, well, I actually started working with manatees by luck. I actually started out straight out of undergraduate and ended up at the National Museum in Washington, D.C. As a museum technician in the mammal division, working for Fish and Wildlife Service. And I got the job by being in the right place at the right time with the right qualifications. And then things sort of went from there. But I'm originally worked on trapping mice for study specimens at the museum and doing bat netting and mammal curation and that. And the person who hired me, the director of the lab, actually happened to be the person who hired Bob Brownell with the beginning of the Sirenia project, which was formed immediately after the Endangered Species Act was put together. And Fish and Wildlife Service had responsibility for all of the Sirenia, international and national. And so I was actually at the museum when Kathy and Bob Bondi came through and were starting to work with the necropsy program in that. And then I worked on my master's part-time while I was working full-time, and then got accepted to the University of Florida in a PhD program. And the parent organization up there in Washington, D.C. transferred me down here to Florida to work. And I continued working with small mammals, but then when I got done with my PhD, Tom O'Shea asked me if I would be willing to do a postdoc type thing, in which we started working with the first estimates of survival rates based on the photo identification of manatees. And that's sort of where things started. So I never envisioned that I would be a statistical person doing demographic modeling, but when you have the right questions, you're very much interested in trying to be able to answer those questions, and the math and the statistics comes much easier when you have a goal and a question you want to answer. And mark recapture, when I first started out with it, was in its infancy with being able to ask interesting questions. So basically when they started out, it was coming up with the number of individuals that were out there, population size, and it's like, well, okay, so you know the number of individuals. But then when I started working with Tom O'Shea in the Sirenia project, then we were able to start doing some stuff with what are the survival rates? What are the breeding probabilities? When you start looking at that, then you start getting at interesting questions. Well, are they constant over time? Why? What is causing maybe a drop in survival rate or changes in the breeding probabilities? And that has important ramifications for an endangered species. And so then it became much more fun, and that was something that I started working with and continuing on with that.
Right. So I think a phrase that describes what you're referring to might be population dynamics. Is that correct?
Yes, population dynamics. So what I'm doing is actually working with a population modeler, who then we take the photo identification data, and from that long term being able to monitor these manatees that come in, we can identify them down to specific individuals. And then it's like a patient coming into a doctor's office. You can actually monitor them over numerous years and come up with a survival rate. The problem with animal populations is that they don't come in to the doctor on a regular basis. So you have to go out and you have to monitor them, and there's the possibility that they're simply there in the area, but you didn't detect them. And so we're using the same type of statistical models in order to look at those that question with regard to survival rates, but incorporating their ability to be detected. And so you have to account for that, otherwise you can come up with a survival rate that's too high or too low based on the fact that you're not sure whether you've seen an animal or not. But the mathematics now is such that you can actually account for that, and that's really cool. And so I do that part of the modeling, which is looking at the survival and reproductive rates. And then I work with a population modeler who is taking all of this information together and putting it into a model to look at population growth rates. And because it's a function of survival rate, a function of having a calf, a function of that calf surviving, a function of that calf surviving to the point where it can actually produce another young. And all of that information needs to go into a model in order to be able to look at the population dynamics. And so as to how the population is increasing, whether it's decreasing, whether it's varying over time, why it's varying over time. And all of this is very important with an endangered species because they need to assess how the population is doing toward recovery.
Right.
And so you need accurate assessments as to whether it's continuing to grow or not, and where it is with regard to recovery. I am sort of in a position where I'm working with the statisticians that are up there in more of a theoretical realm, and the field biologists that know what the animals are doing, and I am making that connection with being able to put those two together.
That's fascinating.
And then the other thing that's important with my job is manatees are a very political species. And so, and manatee recovery is all, a lot of it is based on the particular stakeholders. So we as scientists can provide information with what is going on with the population. Whether it's increasing, whether it's decreasing. But it's the policymakers and the resource managers that have to make a decision as to where, if the population should be reclassified to threatened, whether it's come far enough along, whether it's to the point where it can sustainably contain itself and maintain itself into the future without any problems, and then should be delisted. And that is our major objective as scientists and resource managers, is to get the population back to full recovery. But what is full recovery? We as scientists can say what the population growth rate is, how many animals are out there, but it's still up to policymakers and society to decide when it has reached that. And society does that through the legislation that they produce. So Congress is making laws and saying this is what you have to do with an endangered species. These are the requirements in order to move it along the same line, move things forward. But then you also have society, which is going, what is the value of this population? Do we want to be super careful about making sure that the manatee is fully recovered? So we're willing to accept a probability of extinction. So because we have to project into the future, it's simply a probability. It's not an exact science.
Sure.
But we need to do the population dynamics and work with the population modelers to see whether, yeah, we think the probability that it'll go extinct in, say, 100 years is this amount. Well, if people like, say, the Manatee Club, different aspects of society are interested in a really narrow opinion with that. The likelihood that it's going to go extinct is like this. But then you have to balance that with other things that are going on in the environment. So there's the economy. There is development that could impact the species. And so you have another set aspect of the society that's interested in saying, well, we're willing to be, because we have these other multi-use or other issues with society, we're willing to accept the probability that it won't go extinct that has a confidence interval like this. So Fish and Wildlife Service and resource managers are constantly working at trying to balance what is the science, what are the stakeholders, and where is society. And society then is voting for the Congress and their federal and state lawmakers, and they're the ones that are putting legislation into place. And so by that means, society is coming to a realization as to what type of value they place on this species and how confident they want to be that it's going to move, that the population is not going to go extinct into the future. And with manatees, that can get very contentious. And both different aspects of societies have valid visions for the value that they place on different things. I think there are very, very few people that are out there that just want manatees to go away completely. Everybody values it. So, as a researcher, I have to sit back and provide the best available science, explain how all of those options, what those options mean based on the science that I have, but then try to explain it to the managers as well as the stakeholders and the researchers and the biologists that are collecting the data that I need. So communication is a very important thing to be able to do. And you have to do it over a lot of different, to a lot of different audiences.
For those out there that are younger people and are thinking about, maybe they've had an encounter with manatees and they're thinking, wow, I'd really like to do some work with manatees in my career. What would you tell them about, what they can do to sort of, aim for success and have a successful time going in that direction? What are the things that, from your perspective of having been in the field for 30 years or so, what would you suggest that they do or not do in order to fulfill that dream?
I would say the main thing you do is you need to be jazzed, and you need to find something that really strikes your fancy. And so going into manatee, if you're interested in manatees, that may be a stepping stone that could lead you into working with manatees or marine mammals. But it could also be a stepping stone taking you off in another direction that you had no idea. Because it's a big world out there, and there's a lot of cool things that you can be doing. And I always advise undergraduates that what they need to do is to keep their eyes open and never close a door if there's something that's interesting there. And a lot of times, too, it's figuring out what you don't want to do. So with manatees, you could start working with them and then you find out that it really isn't what you want to do. Or it could lead to an interesting behavioral problem that it's like, wow, but maybe that behavioral problem is also something that could be studied in another species.
The comparative thing.
The comparative thing. I love comparative biology. One of the things I like about manatees is that I get to work with 4 different management regions. And so you've got animals on the Atlantic coast, the Southwest, the Northwest, and the Upper St. Johns River. You can do comparative stuff there. And then there's other marine mammals. So I always advise people to keep your options open. And if it looks like, you've got a dream that you really want to do this, but there aren't any avenues to get there with it. And let's face it, not everyone can work on manatees or one single species. But manatees can teach you a lot, and you can learn a lot as you're going through this. And then keep your eyes open for a particular question that you're interested in that maybe you can go someplace else with. And a lot of things, too, I always say, check off those things that you don't want to do.
Right.
And also, like I said, I never would have thought that I would be working with statistical models, demographic models, and I'm not a theoretician, but it opens a door for you to ask interesting questions, and then you can put time toward it. The other thing, too, is that with all of the threats and stresses and problems that we're facing into the future, the real way that things are going to be going are going to be multidisciplinary studies and multidisciplinary teams. So the broader education that you have and trying out different fields, not just focusing on manatees in one species or one particular aspect of the species, but getting all of these different, looking at different areas of research. A lot of times you can get a different idea. Those people who've been working in a field for so long, they can get channelized. and they get set ideas. And sometimes it takes somebody coming in from outside, working in a different field, that brings something in and say, well, what about this? And they can really advance the field and really make a contribution that way. One thing I think people lose sight of with manatees is that there's two things going on. There is concern for the individual animal. So animals that get whacked by boats, animals that die from cold stress, animals that die from red tide. There's that aspect of conservation, and it's something that's very difficult to see happening with a large marine mammal. And it's something that we as society need to be aware of, and we need to be doing the most we can to prevent this from happening. But there's a distinction with what's happening to an individual animal or sets of animals, and what we're required to do with the persistence of the population and getting the manatee to recovery. So those are two separate issues that I think people need to keep in mind. And there are laws out there, the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And so some of us researchers, as we're working through this stuff, we're focused on the population level stuff. But then there's also the aspect of individual harm to animals. And those are two things that as a society we're very much concerned about. But it takes different approaches to deal with that. And that's something I think that we and the public need to be aware of. So, for instance, if the power plants on the Atlantic coast are taken down, they do go out of operation, which may be something that has to be done. There probably will be death and mortality, and we need to do the best that we can in order to take care of that. But those concerned with the population dynamics are looking at whether that is going to be a significant impact on that,
on the whole population.
On the whole population.
Right.
So there are two things going on there, and it's difficult to deal with both simultaneously. But I think it helps people understand why some people are saying, yes, maybe the data and the population models are supporting reclassification of threatened, and other people would look at it and say, no, there's all of this other stuff that's going on. So you have the letter of the law, and then what we as a society want to do with regard to harm to other animals.
So it's kind of a matter of how much risk as a society we're willing to take, that we trust the probability estimates, whether we want to be more conservative than what the science is telling us, or whether we want to be more liberal in the sense of taking a larger risk. That really is a judgment call.
Yeah.
That brings back the idea of the values that you mentioned before.
So, yeah, and I really feel for Fish and Wildlife Service and FWC, the resource managers. For me, as a researcher, I just get to work with the data. But they have to make some really complex decisions with a lot of people yelling at them.
Yeah.
So it's I think a thankless job. I wouldn't be able to do the work that they do, and it takes a very special person. And I hope there are some people that want to go into that, because it is something that's really valuable. But they have to balance the science, the letter of the law, and then what individual stakeholders, and then they also have their own personal feelings in that.